The conference will be chaired by Ruben Gauricharan, the Professor Abdullah Ruk Chair. So I wish to invite him and to speak a couple of words. Then he will introduce Professor Brij for the first keynote speaker. Ruben, please.
I don't know what to tell about myself, and I rather speak about Brij. And I must confess, it's quite difficult to say something about him because it's a very complicated figure. He represents an important historical period, and he represents also an important future, and that's what he's going to tell us about. Brij calls himself a grandson of an indentured laborer, and by accident he was born in Fiji. His ship was meant to go to Trinidad, but that didn't happen. What's the background of Brij in this conference? For a long time, I think about 35 years, and especially Caribbean historians have been researching indentured labor. So the whole thinking about Indian diaspora, the historical part of the Indian diaspora, was a bit obsessed by indentured labor. And that went on, and I got fed up of that thing. I wanted to make a breakthrough. But before making that breakthrough, I thought, well, maybe we should evaluate first what 35 years or 40 years indentured studies has yielded. And who was the best man to do that? That's Brij. For many reasons, but one important reason is that he has edited an international volume on the Indian diaspora, an encyclopedia of the Indian diaspora. And I think supported by the University of Singapore. Brij himself was based in Australia, and he has many affiliations with other universities, including Cambridge University, I think. So he has a very diverse record. He sings, he dances, he drinks, and if you spend a couple of days with Brij, you become a happy person. I asked him specifically, Brij, you have not only researched, you have also witnessed that period of researching indentured labor. So come and tell us. May I present Brij. Give him a hand.
Namaskaram, Adab Arz, Kemcho, good day, hello, in the Dutch style. Thanks to Rajendra Bhai and to Ruben, it's good to be back in The Hague. Shamini asked me just before tea whether I had a PowerPoint presentation. And I said, no. People of my ancient vintage and Luddite disposition live with the fading hope of making a few powerful points, but we will see. Now, conference going is an occupational hazard, as we all know. But in my career, spanning over 30 years, the conferences that I've enjoyed the most are conferences on the Indian diaspora. And this conference is absolutely no exception. And I enjoy these conferences for two reasons. This conference I'm looking forward to. One is professional and the other one is personal. Professional because I know that I will learn a great deal from the papers that will be presented in the course of the next 2 days. And personal because it is at gatherings such as this that I recognize in your footsteps echoes of my own, that I reacquaint myself with the bonds of affinity and affection that binds us together, bonds forged in a particular crucible of history. I celebrate and share with you the sort of things we take for granted, our essential egalitarian ethos, our subaltern sense of humor, our commitment to inclusion and diversity, and impatience also with rituals and protocols of hierarchy and horoscope. We are, in that respect, essentially egalitarian people. And we also believe this, a fundamental truth, that one doesn't need to be solemn, to be serious. We like to have fun. And as my friend Lomash Rupnarayan of Guyana, but now of Jacksonville, Tennessee, says, at conferences like this, we like to get into the spirit of things. This year marks the 100th anniversary of the termination of indentured emigration from India to the King's sugar colonies across the globe. By that time, by 1917, about 1.3 million, 1.3 million people had crossed the Kalapani. Most never to return. In the end, only about 21% of those who migrated came or returned to India. So we very proudly say that we are NRI too, but NRI of a very distinctive kind, not really Indian. We are not required Indian because we can't get OCI cards. Never returning Indian, not responsible Indian, but not non-resident Indian. Many of the indentured laborers and their descendants, often with their bare hands, laid the foundations of many a third world country in the developing world. And some of them, in the most improbable of circumstances, left the indelible imprint on the world stage. One thinks in this context of Sri Dutt Ramphop of Guyana. One thinks of the immortal Rohan Kanhai, Vijay Singh. We think of V.S. Naipaul, Justice Jairam Reddy of Fiji, and Navi Pillay of South Africa, Ahmed Kathrada and Mek Maharaj, who contributed enormously to the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa. And we bask in the reflected glory of these people. The public celebrations have been remarkable, reflecting, I suppose, an interest in an aspect of our historical experience that for far too long remained unexplored, dormant on the unlovely fringes of our historical consciousness, as a reminder of a past best forgotten. In keeping with the character of our times, a number of websites have sprung up. And these websites do all kinds of strange things, like exchanging news of festivals and food and gossip and rumor and gripe, which we love. And in a sense, really, the temper of these things vary, but I think they do reflect a deep and enduring desire on the part of the great-grandchildren of Girmitias to know, to understand, to connect. This is the point that Mr. Baldev Singh made about the twice vanished or the twice displaced. The celebrations also prompted me to reflect on my own journey over the last 35 or so years, how things have changed or haven't changed. The indenture history is history that for me is up close and personal. It goes to the core of how I understand my identity and my place in the larger scheme of things. It is a subject where the heart and the head come together. My journey began in 1977, when some of you might not have been around, when I went to the Australian National University to do my doctorate, which, as it happened, was on the social background of Indian indentured laborers to Fiji. In effect, I was writing a collective biography of the indentured migrants. Now, it didn't dawn on me then, but I realize now that there was an autobiographical element behind this impulse to understand that history. The great Australian historian Ken Inglis has said that all history is concealed autobiography, and I acknowledge the wisdom of his words. My grandfather, my Aja, was a Girmitia from the district of Bahraich in eastern Uttar Pradesh, who was one of 60,000 who went to Fiji between 1879 and 1916. He went to Fiji in 1908, and after his contract expired, agreement came to an end in 1913, he decided to stay on in Fiji. He had married a woman from another caste, had raised a family of his own, and he realized that he wouldn't be welcome back in the India that he had left. He died in 1962. My grandmother, my Aji, was also a Girmitiya, but about her we knew nothing, not even her name. The details of her journey, and indeed the details of the journey of indentured women generally, is lost in the fog of history. Thanks to a number of scholars such as Marina Carter, Joe Biol, Rosemary Hofte, Rhoda Reddick, and lately people like Kalpana Hiralal and others, they have done a great deal to lift the veil of dishonor from the face of these women. Great work, but more needs to be done. I have fading memory of a group of Girmitiyas in my village and in surrounding areas who used to gather at our place once in a while in their twilights, wearing dhoti, pagdi, and kurta, and sporting a week-long white beard, smoking hookah, and talking aimlessly about their past in a language no one understood. All I knew as a child was that they were a people who had come from a faraway land to which they could not return, living out their lives in a land they could not fully embrace. The words of Matthew Arnold are opposite. They're living torn between two worlds, one dead and the other is struggling to be born. Or as V.S. Naipaul puts it, they lived in a world of, in quotes, familiar temporariness in a state of ambivalence. Girmit was the foundational aspect of our history and indeed the history of many countries where they went. But in the school texts that we read, there was nothing, absolutely nothing about Girmit or indeed about Indians in Fiji. We continued, innocently to revel in the glory of the great British Empire upon which the sun never set. It was much later that I found out why the sun never set on the British Empire. It didn't set because God couldn't trust an Englishman in the dark. In higher grades, we studied, great subjects like the unification of Italy and Germany, the causes of First World War, the Russian Revolution, the history of fascism in Italy and in Germany. But our own history had no purpose, no relevance, no meaning at all. And there was a reluctance even among our own people to look into that history, partly out of shame, partly out of a sense of embarrassment. They had made something of themselves, they had moved on, they did not want to be reminded of their humbling journey. That was what our critics did, to dig up our past to put us in our place at the bottom of the hierarchy. Everyone saw the Girmitiyas at that time through the prism of prejudice. Now there's one fellow, and Ashutosh has written about him, his name is J.W. Burton, a missionary who went to Fiji to work among Indians, who was sent there in 1902. And he wrote a book called Fiji of Today, published in 1910, which was quite useful tool in the hands of those who were working in the indenture system. And what he had to say was that the Indians who came, the indentured laborers who came, were really sweepings of the streets of Calcutta, the riffraffs from the inland towns, the never-do-well from the villages, and men who have become too well known to the police. About Indian women, he said no Indian Girmitiya was not a virtuous man by nature. And women, of course, were evil-faced and loose. And these words were welcome to the ears both of opponents as well as the advocates of indenture. Another great man, C.F. Andrews, the confidant of Mahatma Gandhi, went to Fiji and found everything wrong. He said, and I quote, "Girimities were people covered in pollution and degradation, careless of caste and religion, selling their own daughters for a profit. And Indian women came for a torrid time," in the words and the text of C.F. Andrews. He held them responsible for all the ills of the plantation system: high mortality rate among males, infant mortality rate, the collapse of morals on the plantation, and so on. And he wrote, and I quote, "The Hindu woman in this country is like a rudderless vessel with its masts broken, being hurled down the rapids of a great river without any controlling hand. She passes from one man to another and has lost even the sense of shame in doing this." But how the hell would he know? He was there for only a couple of weeks. He never talked to anybody. But of course, he was the great Sahib, and the great Sahib had spoken. And this kind of prejudiced stereotype continued throughout. His mind was made up before he went to Fiji that we'll abolish the system, irrespective. His mind was made up. He didn't want to be confused with facts. But this is the kind of stereotype that carried on for generations, which explains partly why our own people didn't want to revisit the past. Now, most people of my generation really came to history, came to scholarship, not by deliberate career choice, but by accident, happenstance. It was so with me. We came late to our disciplines, as I've said. We learned its alphabets, tools of the trade, slowly, haphazardly, and gaps remained. Now, in my case, both my parents were illiterate, struggling cane farmers, children of Girimitis, living in the shadow of indenture. Scholarship was beyond their imaginative horizon. They couldn't send me to university. So I went to university, and I think I read this as in Ghulam's paper as well, on government scholarship to train as a teacher of history, of high school, history and English. History at that time was really a subject for no-hopers. The really good ones did physics and law and medicine, because that procured good marriages and brought prosperity and wealth and connections and so on. In any case, good grades, good dose of luck, and the kindly interest of my supervisors, my mentors, ensured that I would have another future, not as a teacher of history and English. Again, at university, there was absolutely nothing on Fiji or the indenture system. Half the population of Fiji was Indian. The majority of students on the campus were all Indian. It was as if Indians were invisible presence in the country. We were regarded as interlopers who polluted paradise and disrupted its peace and quiet and romance. So the struggle to rescue our history from that kind of background was a momentous struggle, and it is still going on. Unfortunately, a lot of people are not doing history. So that rescue effort has to be mounted. How? I don't know. Largely by serendipity, I discovered books on the Indian indentured experience. I began with two books, very fine books. One by Adrian Mayer, called Peasants in the Pacific, which is a study of the culture of Indian people in Fiji in the post-indenture years. And another by Ken Gillian, who happened to be my supervisor at ANU many years later, who published his book called Fiji's Indian Migrants, published in 1962. And these books sort of opened your eyes, because you read in the learned pages written by sahibs, names of people and places that we knew, but to see them printed on paper was a thrilling experience. And from these books, I learned about others. And I have to say that the best books on overseas Indian communities, as we are then called, were written not by historians, but by anthropologists. And these are classic texts. Now you think of Hilda Cooper in Natal, Burton Benedict in Mauritius, Adrian Mayer in Fiji, Morton Klaas and the Niehoffs, Trinidad, de Klerk and Speckman, Suriname, Chandra Jayawardena and Raymond Smith in Guyana, and opened up a new horizon for us. I felt less alone in a rural village or small city in Fiji, knowing that we were connected by history and culture to people around the globe. The best book on indenture until the mid-1960s was this book by Ken Gillian, Fiji's Indian Migrant. It's comprehensive, it is sensitive, it is detailed in a way that hadn't been done before. But it was a book of its time. To use an analogy from African history, it was helicopter history, synoptic, not motorcar history, exploring the bylanes and byways of the experience of these people. That is a task, or would be a task, for the later generation. Undoubtedly, the most important or influential book on indenture, perhaps in the 20th century, was a book by Hugh Tinker called A New System of Slavery, published by Oxford in 1974. It's a very powerful book, connected, ostensibly based on detailed archival research, that draws attention to an aspect of our history that until then lay on the fringes as a stepchild of British imperial history, as a problem in policy making. It was written not by some radical scholar like the great Marxist historian of Guyana, Walter Rodney, but by an eminent sahib of powerful power and prestige living in the heart of the former empire. He drew attention to the emperor's scanty clothing, the like of which we had never seen before, and the effect was sensational. Another interesting thing when I think about the popularity of the book and the slavery thesis is the timing of the publication. Now, if you cast your mind back to the 1960s and 1970s, this is when Harold Macmillan's Winds of Change is reaching Africa, Caribbean, the Pacific, Asia, and so on. Countries are beginning to decolonize, become independent. And the question at the fore of the nationalist debate in many countries was whose culture should have prior claims in national symbolism. And the Indian people right throughout the world had a torrid time. Think about Eric Williams and his Black Power movement in Trinidad. Think of the Forbes Burnham's racist socialism in Guyana. Think about Butondroka, indigenous nationalism in Fiji, asking for the deportation of all Indians as late as 1974. Think of the power of the plantocracy in Mauritius, apartheid in South Africa, the madness of Idi Amin in Uganda, Mahathir's Bumiputra policy, expulsion of Indian settlers from Burma. And so this was kind of history turned ideology of grief and grievance, but demanding recognition and equality because their forebears had sacrificed and suffered. This history was balm on a deeply bruised soul of a people under siege. The slavery thesis is still current in some places, but a large part of my research over the last 30 years has been devoted to interrogating the assumptions and understandings that underpinned the indenture experience and scholarship, whether it was my examination of the social and economic background of the laborers, whether it was the treatment of women on plantations, suicide, and so on and so forth. Because coming from that background, I noticed a discrepancy between what the published material said about these laborers and what I knew of them as a child. Because I knew of them as hardy people, resourceful, pragmatic, cunning, with all the faults and foibles of the human character, who also built up a new life, often unassisted, without a helping hand, who let go of the world they had come from and forged a new way of life in different circumstances. And my understanding led me to a different perspective. I suppose I was motivated to give the Girmitias a modicum of humanity and agency as a people who had a hand in making their own history, and not always as beasts of burden who had no agency of their own. It has been my good fortune to have traveled to nearly all the countries where indentured laborers went. And everywhere I went, and I have been, I've noticed both the similarities in our experience as well as the differences. Points of convergence and points of divergence. Convergence in terms of the experience of indentured laborers, work on the plantations and so on, the brutality of the system and the suffering of the people and so on. It's present in different degrees in every indentured colony in the 19th and early 20th centuries. But also divergence because the experience differed or varied due to the policies of the government, the timing of the migration, and things like that. In some places, indenture was a life sentence that went from one generation to another, particularly in the Caribbean. In other places, it was limited detention of 5 years, after which people were free. And that was certainly the case in Fiji. And so I began to think about what strategies people used, the Girmitias and their descendants used, to change and to adapt. And I think there are a number of factors. I don't have the time to go into them in detail, but a number of things that played an important role. One was religion. Now, you have Muslims had the Quran and the mosques all over the country. And the Hindus mostly had folk Hinduism of rural India, what Milton Singer calls people of the little tradition. And the basic text of popular Hinduism across the different colonies was Tulsidas Das's Ramcharitmanas. It's the story of Lord Rama in Ayodhya. And in his story, people saw a rendition of their own predicament. Rama had been banished for 14 years for no fault of his own, but he did return triumphant at the end. And people believed that their difficulties, however severe at the time, would also end one day. And the Ramayana is still in the main text, and Sherian is here. She has done a book on the Ramayana tradition in Trinidad, which is a fascinating example of how the text has been read from generation to generation. The other important thing was education. These organizations, cultural organizations, Sanatan Dharma, Arya Samaj, Sangam, Muslim League, they established primary schools with no government assistance because government wanted, cheap labor, not half-baked babus who might ask tricky questions. Missionaries didn't show any interest in Indians in Fiji, unlike the Caribbean, where since 1869, the Canadian Presbyterian Mission took a deep interest in Indians. So it was left to Indian parents to start these rudimentary schools. And I am a product of one of those schools. Education played an important role, and we read stories and translated them for our parents at night. We didn't have radio then, no television, no iPhone, nothing, And we entertained ourselves by telling stories, reading stories, and that was very, very important. Later on, you have newspapers coming in Hindi and Telugu and Tamil and so on. And I would say that the newspapers were important for two reasons, at least. One was they published news that the colonial press would not publish, or publish to denigrate the non-white people. And the second thing was that they published stories which stiffened the spine of the people, saying that you too have a culture that you should be proud of. And some of those newspapers I've read and I've got, Jagriti, Fiji Samachar, Jai Fiji, and so on and so forth. And the final one was Hindi movies. I don't know about other places, but in Trinidad, Ramnath Guptar has done wonderful work on Hindi cinema in the West Indies. And Vijay Mishra has written a book called Temples of Desire, looking at the role of Hindi cinema. And what I remember about the Hindi cinema of the 50s and 60s is that the themes they treated resonated in the lives of ordinary people. Themes of exploitation, violence, landlords, greed, love, loss. I don't know how many of you like Hindi movies. I didn't like them until recently. The syrupy stuff, running around trees and so on. But think of some movies like Do Bigha Zameen, yes. Pyasa, Mother India, Waqt. Great movie with a social comment. Pyasa particularly, Guru Dutt's Pyasa is probably one of the greatest movies that Bollywood has made. And so it connected us to a past and gave us a sense of respite in our moments of when we're down. Now, the first generation of indentured scholars came in the 1950s and 1960s. And the reason why they came at this time was because this is when the universities were started. University of West Indies in the 1950s, University of South Pacific in 1968, that produced the first crop of students who then began to take interest in their own history. And that generation is now either passed on or passing from view. Now, you think of some of those people, and we must recognize them for their contributions. Think of Guyana, for example, Dale Bisnath, Tota Mangar, Basdev Mangru, David Chandrabali. Look at Trinidad, Brinsley Samaru, Kusha Harak Singh, Marian Ramesar, Sahadev Basdev. Fiji, Ahmed Ali. South Africa, Surendra Bhana. Now, I have had occasion to disagree with a lot of what they have said and written. I pay respect to them because they set an example and were an inspiration. I should not forget Suriname, and I did forget because they are still here very active. You have Chandrasen Chuni and Moritz, but they're not exactly young spring chicken. No comment on ageism, but you're part of the early generation. They opened the windows for us, and we built on what they left behind, as I'm sure the next generation will do with the work that we have done. Now, the new generation is coming through the ranks. The concern of the new generation of scholars, in history at least, is not with the grand questions of morality, whether indenture was right or wrong. They're much more interested in the lived experience of indenture. They're interested in the new social history, looking at things like food and festivals and, in quotes, the small things that people do on a daily basis. They try and use the particularities of the human experience to project the larger picture, to use the fancy words of Aisha Jalal, the great South Asian historian and the author of a biography of Saadat Hussain Manto, who I'm sure you know, and his great, incomparable short story called Toba Tek Singh. And Aisha says, making the same point in fancy language, that you use micro-historical details to illuminate macro-historical patterns. And this is what the new generation is doing, not judgmental, but trying to understand. And that, I think, is a wonderful, wonderful thing. The other interesting thing in this study of indenture is that now scholars from India are beginning to take interest in aspect of indenture, particularly from the Indian point of view, the Indian perspective. One is sitting here right now, is Ashutosh Kumar, who's just published a book on indenture. There is Charu Gupta, who has done a marvelous piece on the depiction of indentured women in Hindi literature of North India. And then there is Mrinalini Sinha from University of Michigan, who is writing on Tota Ram Sanad's pamphlet, Fiji में मेरे 21 वर्ष, my 21 years in the Fiji Islands, and trying to locate the importance of that in the emergence of Indian nationalist discourse. That's wonderful. There's new sort of interest that's coming. Crispin Bates, who is here or not here? Not yet. He has a major project called Becoming Coolies, and he and Ashutosh and Marina Carter and Andrea Major, and I look forward to fruits of their of the labor. Now, from content to method, as we all know, history is now performed in a variety of ways and in a variety of fora. Books is one way of expressing, but now you have websites, you have all kinds of visual media. The strange and sad thing for me is that they still peddle the old kind of mindless, we suffered in the stones and whips and that kind of history. A history full of sort of, unremitting violence from overseers who brazenly brutalized those under their charge. How the system defrauded the gullible and the innocent. They compose tear-jerking songs with scant regard for factual content or context. Tell endless tales of suffering and desperate longing for home in India. Now, all that is true to some extent, but people forget that 19th century India was not, certainly eastern Uttar Pradesh, was not a land flowing with milk and honey. But nonetheless, this kind of distorted romantic view, the other problem I see with the current trends is that history is in the danger of passing from the realm of or domain of reasoned discourse into the realm of heritage studies, a subject for veneration and reverence. Once derided as damaged people, flotsam of humanity, are now portrayed as men and women who are noble and courageous, without blame or blemish, victims of unremitting violence. And to suggest otherwise is to risk being ridiculed and rejected. So there is that challenge before us as well. Finally, the scholarship of our generation helped rescue Girmitias from the enormous condescension of posterity as a people who were nothing, who remain nothing but beasts of burden. After us, they were no longer just statistics below the surface, hidden from view. We acknowledge their humanity and their role in making their own history against impossible odds in the most difficult of circumstances. We did the best we could with what we had in the time at our disposal. The baton is now passing on to a new generation. What the future will be for the study of Girmit and Girmitias, I do not know. Our job as historians is to predict the past and not divine the future. All I can say is that our Girmit is ending and yours is just about to begin. Thank you.